Thanks very much, Mark. It's really a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about the following sort of subject. Now, if you look at this, we'll see a picture of, you'll remember Rumsfeld, but this isn't about to be political. I just wanted to remind ourselves that he was the one that coined the terms about, there's stuff that we know, there's stuff that we know that we don't know, and there's stuff we don't know we don't know. But he forgot the fourth one, which is there are also things that we know, we just don't know that we know it. So in other words, we may have forgotten. What I'm going to talk to you about today, I don't think there's anything that you don't know or you wouldn't say, oh yeah, I know that, or that makes perfect sense. So it's a little bit about just reminding us about a few factors related to sort of common sense. Well, in this time of COVID, I don't know if you remember or heard about, bank stress tests where the central bank, says what would happen to this bank if all of the loans defaulted, for example. So that's the bank stress test. Well, COVID has sort of been a stress test for our medical care system, and we've probably done pretty good on the acute care side. We haven't even reached 20% capacity at the height with hospital beds or ventilators or any of that. But what about care in the community? Well, we know that COVID has had a significant impact on people. In the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we saw that enjoyment didn't change, but there was a little bit of an increase in terms of worry and anxiety and stress. With COVID, however, we can see that enjoyment went down. People are way more worried and way more stressed. I'm going to misuse the following information. This was from the Health Quality Council last week, where they did a survey of the impact of COVID on people. And one of the things that they asked about was, have the restrictions on visiting family members impacted you? And that could be interpreted any way. You as a family member, did it have an impact? You as a resident, did it have an impact? But basically, nobody said that there was no impact. There was negative impact. Well, what happened with COVID? What did we do with COVID? Well, this is what we did. In fact, we did even more than that. We took people, particularly elderly people, and we said, stay in your houses. Whatever you do, don't come out. Barricade the doors. Don't talk to anybody. So basically, we put people into self-imposed solitary confinement. And even people who had food insecurity, who had to have food delivered, just like in solitary confinement, was the same thing. Oh my gosh, if there had to be a Meals on Wheels delivery, for gosh sakes, don't talk to the person, don't give it to the person, just put it on the doorstep, ring the doorbell, and run away. So basically what we did was we literally put people into some form of solitary confinement. Well, the interesting thing is we know on the correction side, solitary confinement is really bad for you mentally and physically. So why should we expect that this different form of essentially solitary confinement should have any different outcomes? And so there has been a little bit of work and a little bit of people have paid attention, maybe more so now, to the psychological impact of quarantine and what it's had on people. But still, we're still very much concerned about, how many hospital beds, how many ICU beds, how many ventilators. I'm going to take a sharp left-hand turn here and ask you a question, something totally different. And that is, what is the most expensive intervention in healthcare? Is it putting people into an ICU? Is it a course of cancer care? Well, no, it actually turns out to be putting people in hospital. That's the most expensive thing we can do to a person in our healthcare system. And who is it that ends up in hospital? Is it the drug-addicted, schizophrenic, homeless street person? Turns out not. Most of our hospital spaces tend to be occupied by frail, older people or older people with multiple chronic conditions. Now, what do I mean by frailty? Because that's going to be important, coming up. There's going to be a lot of foreshadowing in this talk. This is some of the foreshadowing. So frailty has a number of definitions. One of the definitions of frailty is that you're unable to function independently. And so mild frailty, for example, would be you need help doing your banking or doing your taxes, complex cognitive tasks. And then it sort of goes from there. That's the definition known as the Rockwood definition. Canadian gerontologist, it's used in the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, and it has to do with independence. Another definition of frailty is a walking speed of less than 0.8 meters per second. Why 0.8 meters per second? Because that's the speed you have to walk to cross the street in the length of a walk light. And if you can't cross the street in the length of a walk light, you won't cross the street, and you therefore become, guess what? Dependent. You can't cross the street to go to the grocery store, the doctor, the pharmacist, to visit people, to catch the bus. You now depend on other people to take you to places, and you become frail. Just a little bit of trivia. It turns out that the city of Portland, Oregon, decreased their hospitalization rate in the elderly population by a very expensive intervention. What they did was they went and they increased the length of their walk lights by 2 seconds. Cost them almost nothing, and yet they decreased hospitalization in older people because they turned them from dependent back to independent. Well, with this in mind, could we predict who's going to end up in hospital? Because if we could predict, we could intervene early and prevent that. Well, it turns out this is just a complicated slide that says, no, we can't. Using medical data, there's no way that we can predict who is going to end up in a hospital in the next year with any degree of accuracy. Now, let me contradict myself, because it turns out we actually can predict who's going to end up in a hospital in the next year. Any doctor, any nurse, and in fact, any Meals on Wheels driver with 95% accuracy can determine who's going to end up or predict who's going to end up in a hospital in the next year. And the way in which they do that is the following. And it turns out that the people who end up in a hospital are the following. It's the lonely. We were able to take City of Edmonton data, social data, match it with healthcare data, and what we found out was that with 98% accuracy, by using their loneliness scores of seniors, we could predict who is going to end up in a hospital. And so many of you are probably familiar with the concept of loneliness and social isolation and the impact it has on health. In the NHS in Britain, they equate it to, it has the same impact on your health as smoking half a pack of cigarettes per day. There's a long list of chronic conditions and chronic diseases that are linked with social isolation and loneliness. Things like diabetes, high blood pressure, depression, anxiety, even in fact mortality. The lonelier you are, the more likely you are to die early or prematurely. Well, in healthcare around the world, we talk about sort of this 565, 5% of the population that uses or is attributed to which about 2/3, 66%, 65% of healthcare resources are attributable to. Turns out that the largest proportion of them are significantly lonely. Now, sometimes my medical colleagues will say, well, you're just sort of being Pollyanna, kumbaya, warm, fuzzy types of stuff. Turns out that's not true. It turns out that there is an actual biology behind loneliness and social isolation. So we know that loneliness has direct physical effects on our physiology. It affects our brains, it affects our inflammatory and immune system, it affects all sorts of things. I don't want to get too scientific here, but this is just a slide that says they studied people's loneliness or social isolation, and they found that the lonelier you were, the more you had underlying inflammation, or you activated your immune system, your blood pressure was higher, your weight was greater, your chances of getting diabetes were greater. Another study showed that loneliness enhanced your feelings of pain, of fatigue, and it had an impact on your ability to fight off viruses. And you don't have to know anything about genetics to interpret this slide. This is gene expression in lonely versus socially connected people. And you can actually see that there are about 220 genes that are affected by being lonely. But the best study of all, one that's really, really important now, is this. In this study, they took about 200 and some students university students in Sweden. And they divided them into lonely versus non-lonely, essentially. Then they actually exposed them to the cold virus, the common cold. And they looked at who got the cold. And basically what the slide said was that the lonelier you were, the more likely you were to actually get the cold when exposed. So bringing this back to us now, in the fall of 2020, what have we done? We've socially isolated people, barricaded them, restricted visitors. In other words, we've made them lonely in order to prevent infection, but in fact, we've made their immune systems more susceptible to virus infections. Well, how can we treat loneliness? What can we do about loneliness? Well, they surveyed this in the National Health Service. They asked older people, what is it that you miss? What would make you less lonely? And you can see this list here. Well, I just want to sit with someone. I want to have a laugh with someone. You know, I want a hug, to get a hug, have a holiday, share a meal, go for a walk, hold hands. But what have we done in COVID? If you go down the list of what is forbidden in COVID, that's the same list. You can't sit with someone, oh my gosh, we got to be physically distanced, 2 meters. Can't laugh or sing, that would spread COVID. Getting a hug, can't do that, COVID. Have a holiday, no, we banned all holidays. Share a meal, can't do that. We closed down our restaurants, can't share meals. Maybe go for a walk as long as you're distance. Can't hold hands, physical distancing. We've taken away simple things that can have a significant impact on people. So what is it we could do to make up for that? Well, I know that we've all tried. What can we do? What's the sort of the least worst thing that we can maybe get away with? Well, social media, using iPads and various forms of connection remotely is about the best we can do. It's not perfect. It's not the best answer, but it is an answer. It's something that we can do to help people be less lonely. There's some suggestions, and I'm happy to share these slides with you here so you don't have to worry about reading every little tiny line here, but there's just something in this list of what can we do in institutionalized people to help them feel less lonely, to improve their social engagement. And you can see this arrow here that talks about reminiscence. So how many times as an older person, and we do this, really young people, when older people, their grandparents say, I remember when, back in the winter of, 54, and everybody rolls their eyes. When older people reminisce, it actually turns out that reminiscence has an importance for older people. And so when older people reminisce, they talk to us about the past, it's actually really, really important. It turns out there's 7 potential functions of reminiscence. One is just people enjoy telling what it was like when they were. But the other thing is it helps people rationalize what's happening to them now based on their past experience. It helps them understand current situations by their past exposure. So there's a whole number of beneficial functions of reminiscence. So next time we're talking to an older person and they say, I remember when, let's not roll our eyes. Or maybe we could ask them, what was it like when, to help them with reminiscence. This is a picture I took. I was in Buenos Aires about 2 years ago doing a tour. And we're getting a tour. The tour guide was talking about Mendoza, who discovered South America. That was his statue in the background there. But my attention was drawn to this, obviously homeless street person. You can see the shopping cart, torn clothing. But what drew my attention was that he had a piece of bread, and he was feeding these pigeons that bread. And in my self-righteous way, I said, to myself, why is he feeding that bread to the pigeons? He could use it himself. He probably needs to eat it himself. And then it struck me, for that 5 minutes that he was feeding the pigeons, those pigeons were his best friends. And then I thought a little bit more, and I thought more than that, for that 5 minutes, he suddenly had a purpose in life. He had somebody or something that depended on him. There was purpose to his life. And so what's one of the questions that we ask about socially isolated people? How often do you participate in meaningful activities? And you can guess the result. If you're lonely, socially isolated, there is no participation in meaningful activities. And you're probably all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or pyramid of needs. Well, let me tell you, I don't believe in this. I think it's a bunch of nonsense. There's no pyramid, there's no hierarchy. In other words, I think that self-actualization, having self-esteem, is absolutely every bit as important as having food, water, and shelter. Another picture, homeless person with a dog. And again, in my self-righteous way, what right do you have to be looking after a dog when you can't even look after yourself? Well, and then we think, but this person has a companion. He has someone to, or some being to love him, something to love, someone to take care of. It adds meaning to his life, which is also biologically critically important. So just like loneliness and social isolation has a biological impact, so too does meaning in life. It helps us with our physical health and our mental health and our cognitive function, our thinking. And what's one of the things that happens? Well, when we're in our teens, we're looking for meaning in life. So ignore all of the little dots on this diagram and just focus on the two lines. So the blue line that sort of goes up is as we get older, we start to develop meaning. We have families, there's a purpose for our existence, we have jobs, but then as we retire, children grow up, move away, we start to lose that meaning. The green line is the inverse, is our search for meaning. So as we get older, we lose purpose, and we start to search for what good am I? What am I here for? What can I do? So it turns out that having meaning in life actually helps us as we age. So we might ask ourselves, and I was going to say, I forgot to say earlier on, that I was told by Linda, by your CEO, that again, all I had to do is give you a little bit of information and the light bulbs would start flashing and going on, and you'd be able to come up with all sorts of really cool ideas as applies to helping people that you serve. So how can we help people have meaning in their lives of any age? Well, it turns out happiness requires three things: something to do, someone to love, and something to look forward to. But I just want to draw your attention to the fact that someone to love, not someone to love you necessarily, that's maybe number 4, but someone to love, some purpose in life. Well, what has COVID done? Well, we have nothing to do, particularly as winter comes. We have nothing to look forward to. So now we're having an impact on meaning in life. So someone to love, someone to look after, something to do is going to be critically important. It turns out that if you give people the choice of sitting in a room alone, doing nothing, having no purpose, versus getting electric shocks, they will actually choose the electric shocks. That's how important it is. How many times have we heard this? I don't want to be a bother. No, I don't want to be a bother. What are people saying? They're not speaking English when they say, I don't want to be a bother. Let's think really carefully what we're being told when people say, I don't want to be a bother. What they really mean is the following, is I long to be independent. I don't want to be frail. I don't want to be dependent on somebody else. I want to contribute. I want to feel useful. I don't want to just sit there and have things done to me. Or similarly, here, I'll do that for you. What are we actually doing to people? Well, again, same thing. I long to be independent. I don't want to be frail. I want to contribute. I want to feel useful. I'm getting up there in age, and I've got 2 big burly sons, and I'll go maybe to lift something heavy. Oh, no, Dad, don't do it. I'll do it for you. And I know they're doing the right, for the right reason. They want to be helpful and kind and considerate, but how do I feel when they say that? I sort of feel inside, well, that's nice, but what do you think? You think I can't do it anymore? You think I'm useless? We have to be really, really careful to maintain meaning in people's lives. Places like Japan, everybody has a job. If you're 8 years old, you know what? We in the community are going to ask you to sweep this 10 meters of street once or twice a week. We're going to give you a role so that you feel important, so that you have meaning. Someone to love, someone to look after. Where do we see this? We can see this in pet ownership. Pet ownership has huge benefits because all of a sudden you've got somebody that loves you and you've got somebody to look after. So yeah, the puppy will, pay attention to you and love you. The cat will, sort of tolerate your presence. Maybe, the goldfish, it just blows bubbles, but you have somebody to look after. What can we do about that? I know in long-term care facilities you can't have dogs or pets necessarily, but even looking after a plant gives you a purpose, something to look after. Cities like Edmonton and Vancouver know that pet ownership can be so important to people's mental health, they actually put in off-leash dog parks once dog ownership and pet ownership gets to a certain density. And even if you can't have a pet, turns out that the teddy bear that you can hug, inanimate objects can often function as a surrogate. We do it for children in surgery, do it for children in hospital, in the emergency department, and there's the teddy bear. Turns out that if you have a precious object from somebody else and you hold it, it almost has that same benefit as looking after something else. So again, even touching an inanimate object that is important to somebody else can have a very powerful impact. Well, I want to come back to this slide. Remember I said there's going to be foreshadowing. What do older, lonely people miss, or just lonely people miss? Because a lot of single people that are younger that miss things, or disabled people that can't get out. Well, getting a hug and holding hands, what's common there? Touch. So when we go out on a date or date night, do you want to do it from a distance, or do you want to hold hands, snuggle up together? Turns out that human touch is really, really important. That touching people has a whole host of biological benefits as well. And I'm not going to go through them all here, but it has benefits on our immune system, on our mental health, on all sorts of, it decreases pain, decreases anxiety. Hugging has all sorts of benefits as well. But what have we done in the time of COVID? Well, we've taken away that ability for touch and hugging. So it has an impact. I don't have an easy solution. Maybe we can hug teddy bears. That might have of an impact, but people are missing that. And it does have a very specific biological effect. All of the lists of things of benefits of hugging here are all based on clinical trials and studies. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but we can actually describe the neuroendocrinology, the changes in brain chemicals and hormones that happen when you touch a person. The second you touch a person, there's all sorts of beneficial hormones and brain chemicals that are released, and we're missing that in the time of COVID. How can we solve that? Let's go back to the Swedish university students. So they also looked at who was prone to get the cold, to get the virus infection. So they now changed these students and they divided them into two groups, those who got a lot of hugs and those who didn't get a lot of hugs. And guess what? The people that had a lot of hugs were much less likely to get the cold virus. Those who were not subject to touch and hugging, much more likely to get hugs. Same thing, what are we doing in COVID? Some of the people we may serve may have dementia, early dementia. They may become physically agitated. They may become emotionally or mentally agitated. What helps with agitation in dementia? They looked at everything that you could possibly do to decrease agitation. What came out on top? This is sort of a complicated wheel, but if you look sort of at the spokes of the wheel, everything that's green, two things that stood out. First thing was getting a massage, in other words, touch, had the greatest impact on soothing people. The other thing was going outside to the outdoors in the green. It turns out that anybody in green and green space calms down and relaxes. What do? Stay shut in, don't go outside. So let's go back to our solitary confinement that we've put older people in or disabled people in. Just as a reminder, what else does it do? Well, people in long-term care, 75% of the time is sedentary. So if we think of the converse of this slide, what happens when people sit and aren't able to get out and be active and mobile? Well, they start becoming deconditioned. It has an impact on them, not only on conditioning, on falls, on walking, on muscular strength, but also on skin breakdown. It has an impact on memory, mood, all of those sorts of things, cardiovascular health. So now we're having this direct physical effect by putting people, locking them up in their rooms or in facilities, not allowing for that activity. And so again, can't walk at 0.8 meters per second, starting to have falls, you become frail, you become dependent, so on and so forth. How can we solve this? What can we do to try and mitigate this? One of the other things I just wanted to finish up with a little bit was volunteering. So one of the other things, of course, we did was with COVID, we can't have the volunteers. Let's get rid of them, boot them out of the institutions and facilities. And AHS, we have 14,000 people who volunteer. We, day one of COVID, banished them all. Turns out the people who volunteer, what are we doing them? They have purpose in life. So now we've taken away their purpose. Benefits of volunteering, it actually decreases their rate of functional decline. So decreases frailty, decreases, or it improves memory, improves mood, improves physical health. All sorts of benefits to the volunteer and to the person that is volunteered for. One of the things I wanted to point out, so I'm from the healthcare system, but what we're talking about is not just about health. I know we focused with COVID on health. We want to prevent this infection. We want people to have perfect health. But what if I could give you perfect health? If I could give you a magic pill, just like a fable, I will give you this magic pill, gives you perfect health, no colds, no flus, no cancer, no heart disease, no nothing, you'll die in your sleep, age 120. Would you take the pill? Everybody says, of course I'm going to take the pill. I say, but just like the fable, there's a catch to this pill. If you take this pill, you must agree to one thing. You must agree to live homeless, cold, hungry, and lonely on the street. Now, will you take the pill? Because you're going to have perfect health. Isn't that the goal? Perfect health? So we can see it's not about health. It's about wellness. So this slide is just a reminder to me about the World Health Organization, and I saw again on your slides the importance of person-centered care. What's important to the person versus what's important to us? Do we think about that often enough? I know it's really challenging in COVID. We don't want to be spreading infection, making people sick, contributing to the mortality rate, but what's important to people? And that's the essence of person-centered care. The slide talks about the World Health Organization, every person having a plan to maintain their purpose in life, to understand where they've come from, understand their narrative, and to co-create, goals and strategies for meeting people's goals. So I'd just like to finish up by saying, we think about healthcare systems as, hospitals and high technology and all that sort of thing, but that's not what a healthcare system is. All of us are part of the healthcare system and maybe in the health and wellness care system. Really, a healthcare system is just people looking after people. Everything I hope that I've told you today, you probably say, oh, gee, I realize that, I know that, now I know that I actually knew that these simple things are important, of social interactions, of touch, of purpose in life, of hugging. Your job, I would suggest, or your challenge is, what is it that we can do about it to help the people that we serve achieve these goals? How can we help look after other people? How can we help each other look after each other? Thanks very much, and thanks once again for this opportunity.